What does a beautiful future look like to you?
You can flip a negative mood on its head.
This was a talk that was all over the place, but then New York, you are all over the place.
There are experiences that you just don't get anywhere else.
When you go to Google and type in climate change is, you're going to see different results depending on where you live and the particular things that Google knows about your interests.
That's not by accident, that's a design technique.
What I want people to know is that everything they're doing online is being watched, is being tracked. Every single action you take is carefully monitored and recorded.
A lot of people think Google's just a search box and Facebook's just a place to see what my friends are doing. What they don't realize is there's entire teams of engineers whose job is to use your psychology against you.
I was the co-inventor of the Facebook like button.
I was the president of Pinterest,
Google, Twitter,
Instagram.
There were meaningful changes happening around the world because of these platforms. I think we were naive about the flip side of that coin.
We get rewarded by hearts, likes, thumbs up, and we conflate that with value and we conflate it with truth.
A whole generation is more anxious, more depressed.
I always felt like fundamentally it was a force for good. I don't know if I feel that way anymore.
Facebook discovered that they were able to affect real-world behavior and emotions without ever triggering the user's awareness. They are completely clueless.
Fake news spreads 6 times faster than true news. We're being bombarded with rumors.
If everyone's entitled to their own facts, there's really no need for people to come together. In fact, there's really no need for people to interact.
We have less control over who we are and what we really believe.
If you want to control the population of your country, there has never been a tool as effective as Facebook.
We built these things and we have a responsibility to change it. The intention could be, how do we make the world better? If technology creates mass chaos, loneliness, more polarization, more election hacking, more inability to focus on the real issues, we're toast.
This is checkmate on humanity.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm very excited to have this incredibly important conversation with the people behind the new documentary called The Social Dilemma. Before we dive in, and there's an awful lot to talk about, a lot of issues that are raised by this documentary, I wanted to first introduce our panelists. And in the era of Zoom, if you all can wave as I introduce you, just to help people know who you are, which one is you. Jeff Orlowski is the director. He's also the director, producer, and cinematographer of the award-winning films Chasing Coral and Chasing Ice. Tristan Harris is a good friend of mine, I'd like to say. I hope you think so too, Tristan. He is the president and co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology and a former Google design ethicist. He's been called the closest thing Silicon Valley has to a conscience. Tim Kendall is CEO of Moment. Hi, Tim. He's also the former president of Pinterest and the former director of monetization, boo, of Facebook. Anyway, Kathy O'Neill is a professor and entrepreneur, and I hope you all noticed that her hair matches. Is that your blanket, Kathy, or your chair?
Yes, I needed my blanket, yes.
All right, it matches your blanket. Kathy earned a PhD. Okay, Kathy is kind of a brainiac. She earned a PhD in math from Harvard, was postdoc at the MIT math department, and is a professor at Barnard College, where she published a number of research papers in arithmetic, algebraic, geometry, which makes me break into a cold sweat. Kathy, I hope you know that. Anyway, she is in the film and has a lot to say. Meanwhile, Rashida Richardson is a visiting scholar at Rutgers Law School and Rutgers Institute for Information Policy and Law, where she specializes in race, emerging technologies, and the law. So I'm thrilled to, as I said, to be able to have this conversation. This is an area that I've been interested in for some time. So thank you so much for doing this. And Jeff, let me start with you. As I mentioned, your past work includes Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral, which really focused on climate change. So I'm curious, what made you want to turn your lens to social media and technology, a very different subject in so many ways?
Different in some ways and very similar in other ways. I think our team has always been interested in big problems and big challenges, and the existential threat of climate change was where we spent a lot of time. And then when learning from Tristan and others in the film about what's at stake here, the seriousness of the way our technology is reprogramming civilization, we realized this was a huge, huge issue facing society. Ironically, it's my own filter bubble that got me into this, was seeing posts from Tristan and other friends. And I was in a small group of people that I was hearing these conversations a couple of years ago. And it was that insight that said, wait a second, there's a much, much bigger story here. And we set out to explore that.
You know, I've produced documentaries as well on big, thorny social issues. And I'm curious what some of the challenges were for you in just actually putting this documentary together, because I know it took 3 years, Jeff.
Yeah, it was.
I imagine there were parts of it that weren't so easy.
Right. It was a big project and a big undertaking. When I first started speaking with Tristan and getting Tristan's perspective, we started reaching out to other former employees from the companies as well. And it was difficult to get people to just be willing to speak on the record. I feel like I had to twist Tim's arm a bit to get him to speak on camera. And it was challenging because I was very, very curious about the perspectives from the people who were inside the companies. And that was sort of a foundational backbone. And then from that thinking, then we reached out to Rashida and Kathy and others to kind of surround that insight and that knowledge and to give us a perspective here. We also really wanted the film to be very accessible to the general public. And so we were really, as a creative team, thinking through, how do we bring it to life? How do we make it interesting? How do we make it accessible? How do we get the public to think about this in a different way? As much as I love all of the brilliance in all of the talking heads, right? I say that with dear love and affection. Not everybody wants to watch a documentary. And we were really trying to figure out, how do we make a film that a lot more people want to come and see and to bring into the conversation, then to have conversations like this to follow up.
And, you know, I think one of the great things about the film, Jeff, is it really takes a deeper dive into these concepts that people may kind of sense, but they're somewhat oblivious to, because they are so keyed in to the technology and what it allows you to do and the world it opens up to you. They don't think of some of the repercussions. And Tristan, you've been thinking about this for a long time. As I mentioned, you've been called the conscience of the Silicon Valley. And I think it's probably instructive for people to hear your backstory just a little bit. And what made the switch? What made you flip the switch and say, wait a second, this is not a good thing that I'm doing?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. It's good to see you here, and thank you for doing this. I was at Stanford studying a computer science degree, and my friends in college started Instagram. And I saw a lot of my friends who were the same age, and I'm the same age as Zuckerberg. A lot of my friends, when we were in college, would talk about all these positive, social impact-driven things we wanted to do in the world with technology, with computer science. And I saw more and more of my friends get sucked down the kind of rabbit hole of building these big technology companies that would get lots of engagement and growth. And less of our choices had to do with, hey, how can we make the world better? And more of our choices had to do with, how could we keep people engaged and suck people in? And I noticed that just became this race to go deeper and deeper into human psychology, to figure out a deeper way to manipulate our really lizard brain instincts. And the founders of Instagram and I studied at a lab at Stanford called the Persuasive Technology Lab. where we learn many of these things. And as the film talks about, I had a background in magic and behavioral economics and kind of how is the mind fooled. And I saw that more and more of it had to do with this trickery. And that would create this huge confusion if we didn't, as a tech industry, come together and say, we have a moral responsibility to get this right. And we also have a moral responsibility to have regulation that can create the incentives for technology companies to do the right thing, which is not the case currently.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it. It's really sort of, they play on this Pavlovian response in many ways, as you describe as the lizard brain. And I want to use a couple of terms here. By the way, I encourage everybody watching this panel to really go back and watch the movie, because Jeff and everyone involved, you all did a great job of really outlining the host of issues from addiction to polarization that really is part and parcel of the digital world. But real quickly, Tristan, can you just give us kind of an appetizer? One of the concepts in the film is, if the platform is free, you are the product. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, if you just ask people, how much have you paid for your Facebook account recently? And people think for a second, they realize they haven't paid at all. Well, then how is it worth more than $500 billion as a company? And the answer is that we are the product. And so long as we are the product, meaning advertisers pay so that we are influenced. But so long as we are the product, that means that we're worth more if we're addicted, distracted, outraged, polarized, and disinformed, because that meant that the attention mining model was successful. We're worth more when we're kind of domesticated into this kind of hyper attention switching, distracted, addicted kind of human. And I think that the big confusion is when we look in the mirror of technology, we've been told these are just neutral platforms. They're just showing us a reflection in the mirror. This is who you are. You have a lizard brain. But it's really a funhouse mirror where it's amplified the lizard brain parts of ourselves. And we like to say, since the film deals in conspiracy theories, lizard people do actually walk among us and run the world. It's just that we're the lizard people because it's actually taken our lizard brain and made that the pilot of our choices, which is dangerous when you zoom out and say, what is this doing to democracy and to societies around the world?
Let's talk about addiction, though, before we talk about polarization, which, of course, so many people are going to be interested in hearing, especially because we're so close to an incredibly important election. Tim, I'm curious from you about addiction. And you yourself admitted that you have trouble putting your phone away. You say when, you should be spending quality time with your kids, you're in a closet, checking emails. Yeah. And I know Tristan has really examined the mechanisms that are used to addict people, whether it's bright colors or, and we can talk to Kathy in a minute about AI and how that is contributing. But Tim, from a monetization point of view, how does Facebook, how do they get us so we feel like we're going cold turkey when we're not close to our devices?
Well, I think it all started. They prey on human weakness, and I think the light bulb really went off for them when they invented photo tagging 15 years ago. When they realized that, if we let Katie know that a picture of her just got posted to Facebook, we send her an email. She comes to the site 100% of the time. And she stays for this amount of time. And so there's this notion of these technologies. I think the insight there was, wow, if we can prey on, Katie's, social self-consciousness or kind of all of our phobias about a bad picture being posted online, we can get incredible engagement. And the dimensions on which they prey on our prefrontal cortex have just been added, right? All the terms that Tristan just explained. And I think what's especially scary is that they've preyed on all these dimensions, right? Our need for belonging, our need to express anger, our need to watch a car crash. They preyed on all of these, and there are only so many people in the world, and there's only so much time. But these services and their value is predicated on consistent and high rates of growth, which basically means they have to get better and better at it, which happens at our expense.
Well, so what was it for you that said, I'm sure you were making a boatload of money at Facebook. What employee were you, by the way?
I think I was around 95 or something.
So you had probably, a nice chunk of change working there, but then you decided, like, I can't do this. Was there an aha moment?
That wasn't, I'd love to give myself credit for that was 10 years ago. So I'd love to give myself credit for seeing the future 10 years ago, but I didn't. I just wanted to go to another company, Pinterest in this case, that did similar things. I think we can argue it's doing less harm in the world by a pretty wide margin compared to Facebook at the moment, but the mechanisms are the same in terms of the algorithms being used to bring people onto the platform and have them spend increasing amounts of time by convincing them, in the case of Pinterest, that they need things. And so, my reckoning, if you will, came probably right when I had my first daughter, so 6 years ago, when I started to realize that my phone and the services on my phone were more interesting than my first child. And notwithstanding sort of my core values, which is that I wanted more than anything to be the best dad I could be, I couldn't get my behavior in congruence with that. And so that misalignment, that sort of psychological misalignment was a red alert for me. And I started to talk more about it in my job at Pinterest, talk more about it publicly, and then ultimately decided to leave Pinterest to really try to help, bring to bear technology to help individuals and families with this problem.
And that's what really motivated you to start Moment.
Yeah, which there was a different founder of Moment, but I joined an existing company and then became the CEO.
Kathy, you explored the biases of algorithms a lot in your work. Can you explain for people who may not be super well versed in tech, sort of the whole concept of algorithms and the role they play in our lives?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'm going to answer the same question you asked, Tristan and Tim, which is like how I saw the light, because it'll also explain that.
Sure.
Which is that I was a mathematician until I became a quant at a hedge fund in 2006. And I kind of just got this front row view of the credit crisis. And I saw, in particular, if you remember the AAA ratings on mortgage-backed securities, that were essentially lies. Those were algorithms. Those were risk algorithms trying to convince us to trust them. And I was like, that is a big old mathematical lie that really made a problem that was already a problem, the housing bubble, much worse, especially when it exploded in front of us dramatically all of a sudden. So I quit after a while, trying to, I'll skip some details, but I became a data scientist, sort of, once again, eating the Kool-Aid, drinking the Kool-Aid of like, oh, now I'm a data scientist instead of a hedge fund quant, I can do good with data. But what I saw was these algorithms that I was now using to predict humans instead of the market were also flawed. And moreover, they were very directly related to this concept that both Tristan and Tim have described, which is like making people feel like their self-worth is on the line. I was deciding whether somebody was worthy of an opportunity online. And moreover, I realized that I'm good at my job. I'm a good mathematician, I'm a good data scientist. And what I was doing was super dumb, Katie. I was like, how much are you worth? Where do you live? Are you a man or a woman? I was deciding I was deciding who was worthy. But what I essentially was doing was I was saying, you have a profile of a lucky person, and I'm going to give you an option. I'm going to make you luckier. You, on the other hand, you have a profile of an unlucky person based on your browser history. And if you're unlucky, I'm going to make you unluckier. I'm going to segregate the world into the lucky, who I'm going to make luckier, and the unlucky, who I'm going to be unluckier. And what I saw was that every data scientist was doing this. We were all segregating the world and streamlining them into these paths that were basically propagating the past. And it was going to create a feedback loop and lots of harm.
Can you give me real world examples, Kathy? Like,
sure.
I'm sort of following you, but not totally. You know, can you give me a real world example that might help our viewers?
Sure, yeah. So I was working in ad tech, which is basically what Facebook is built on. So I was deciding who gets sort of an offer in the world of travel, Expedia, cheap tickets. That was the world I was working in. But the same exact methodologies were being used in insurance. Like, based on your profile, you might get diabetes. I'm not so sure about how much this health insurance should cost. Based on your profile, people like you didn't always pay back their loan, so we're going to charge you extra. And moreover, people like you were willing to pay more for car insurance, even if you wouldn't actually represent a higher risk. But if you're willing to pay more, we're going to charge you more. So there was all sorts of ways that sort of old school scamming was becoming digitized. And moreover, it was getting legitimized because we all trusted big data. We all trusted algorithms.
So it was basically taking advantage of people and actually preying on them for their depending on their socioeconomic status and past behavior, right?
100%. In fact, a VC came to our firm, and again, it was just a travel industry ad tech firm. And he said to the entire company, he said, you know, I'm dreaming of the day, and he was an architect, I should say, of the internet, because he was a VC deciding who to give money to in the world of ad tech. He was like, I can't wait for the day when I never all I see are ads for trips to Aruba and jet skis, and I never again have to look at another University of Phoenix ad, because those aren't for people like me. And I was like, oh wait, who are those for actually? And I looked into it, and I was like, single black mothers who are poor enough to qualify for financial aid and who don't know the difference between a private college and a for-profit college. So they're literally preying on people who, you know, are trying to make their lives better for their children. It was absolutely predatory. But that was actually his vision, his intention. And so yes, Katie, it was really demographic. It was very related to race and gender and money. So I was also concerned, you know, I was concerned with lots of different algorithms and predictive algorithms that were sort of representing really important decisions in people's lives, like what I said, college admissions, getting a job, getting insurance, getting a loan. And I was also concerned with political information, and that's where I came to Facebook and social media, because I was studying the extent to which political campaigns know so much about us, that there's this asymmetry of information. They know more about me than I know about them. They get to decide which of the 20 things I agree with most that they want to tell me about. And even if I go to their website, the cookies follow me, they still have my profile. They can still show me the one thing that their candidate agrees with me and ignore everything else. And what's worse, and this is something that I only partly predicted when my book came out in 2016 before the election, is they don't even have to give us information. They can literally give us propaganda to prevent us from wanting to vote in the first place. They can literally commit voter suppression, and we did see that. And they can predict who it's going to work on. So what's worse, Katie, is that people like you who are journalists and like would know better and would recognize this as propaganda, they're not going to show that to you. They have a score for every user about how likely that user is to object to what they're seeing. And they're not going to show that to people who would know better. So it was really pernicious. And I needed to say something about it, so I quit my job in data science and wrote that book. I mean, I'm just saying, like, the algorithms that we built on a daily basis were definitely making inequality worse, and they were definitely destroying democracy.
Rashid, I was going to ask you about that, since you really are a student of this intersection of race, technology, and law. How do you see it? What kind of societal effects do you see when it comes to these big internet companies and this, information age really polluting society and exacerbating some of the biggest social ills that we face today?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of compounding of probably the ugliest parts of society happening in any setting where data is being used to generate outcomes, and that's definitely part of the process within social media platforms. So if you accept as the ground truth that we live in a socially inequitable society, if you're using data that's reflecting our society, it's going to amplify that. But then when you compound that by the fact that many of these algorithms and systems are being designed by a very homogenous and small minority of people, mostly white men, then their worldview is also being imported into these systems. And a lot of the imbalances that Kathy just outlined, as in who is lucky, who's not lucky, who's deserving of opportunity, or who's deserving of certain benefits, that's all playing out at a global scale and on not just one platform, but multiple. So it really sort of skews our view of reality in a way where you may see and consume information in a way that's confirming your worldview and making you think, oh, we live in an equitable society, but in reality, it's the complete opposite happening. And it also serves to worsen what the status quo already is in many ways, in that if we stick with the advertising examples, if you're advertising jobs and you're using an algorithm that has a racial and gender bias, then that's going to further compound who's getting the higher paying jobs or who's getting better opportunities in society. And that's happening across many different domains. So in general, it's an interesting area. I came into this because I was working on civil rights issues and saw that big data, tech, and AI were all sort of infiltrating all of these issues and compounding them, making the issues that I was trying to help fix harder to fix. And I think we're seeing that across the realm, whether we're talking about voting rights issues, school segregation, or even equitable employment. These technologies are in many ways just worsening what's already not a great start.
I remember exploring this when I did a National Geographic hour on this and talked to Tristan about it. And they were just starting to realize how biased AI was for that very reason, Rashida, because of the people who were creating this intelligence. It was from their worldview. Would the problem be mitigated in any way, shape, or form? Kathy and Rashida and anybody else can chime in. If in fact there was more diversity that was coming up with these algorithms or the artificial intelligence, because I remember writing doctor into Google and looking at the images. And at the time, they were all pretty much white guys with white coats and did not show diversity. And that was reflecting the people who are programming the AI. So how much of the problem would be solved, Kathy, you first, if we had a more diverse group of people who was doing this? And it seems to me that it would help, but the problem is even much bigger than that, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually run an algorithmic auditing company now. And so this is exactly the question we ask our clients, like, how do we get a lot more diverse viewpoints into the design and the implementation of this algorithm? And what I've noticed, Katie, is that you don't actually need to have them all in the data science team. The data science team, honestly, has been way overloaded. They have been in charge of not only coding, but basically making ethical decisions, deciding on all sorts of things that they really have no business or expertise to do. So the way I have framed it in my company is you start with the list of stakeholders, like who cares about this algorithm? Like if you have customers, if it's say it's a mortgage lending company, like the customers care. What does it mean for them for this to be successful or a failure? If you deny people mortgages unfairly, those are a stakeholder that you have to bring into this conversation. And it's in fact quite obvious that people of color, Black people especially, have been redlined from mortgages. So you should specifically talk to people representing that stakeholder group about what would mean for this mortgage company to fail. And so you you get their opinion, you bring them into the conversation, and this is before the algorithm is built, or at least before it's deployed. And the idea is that the data scientists, instead of like making these decisions for the sake of everyone without having any historical information or knowledge about how mortgages have historically been denied to people, that they should be told after the fact, after the values have been laid down, here's what the values are. You have to make these tests to make sure they're fitting the criterion that we want. And that's your job, is to translate those values into code. It's not to make those values, to decide on those values, if you will. So the answer is, we absolutely must realize that algorithms are everywhere. There are, we don't have humans making decisions anymore. College admissions offices in the next few months are going to be decimated by budget cuts. They're going to be turned into essentially algorithms. And the question we have to ask is, well, for whom are they going to fail? Who gets to decide what it means for this to work or fail? And we have to make that a larger and broader conversation.
And Tristan, I mean, you were kind of the ethics guy until you weren't, right? Why don't these companies have any interest in having someone present, or a team of people present, talking about the larger impact, societal impacts of some of these technologies? Is it because they don't care?
Yeah, I think that, I agree, first of all, with everything that Kathy just shared. It's heartbreaking when you see the scale of harms that are being generated in places where there's no representation. I think a good example of this, first of all, is I think it's the case that 70% of Facebook users are outside the US, which means that the assumptions of the design team that are sitting there in Menlo Park are going to be incomplete or incorrect 70% of the time. Then you have the issue of these technology companies really aggressively going into markets in places where there isn't infrastructure. They're going into Myanmar, different countries on the African continent, and they're actually establishing the infrastructure. So they're saying, hey, when you get a cell phone, we're going to do a deal with the telecom. So you get a cell phone, you get a phone number, and you get your first phone in Myanmar. Facebook comes built into the phone. You get a Facebook account. And they're actually, this is important, it actually crowds out other places, other players who could be there. So for example, you go into a country that didn't even have internet before, and suddenly all the content that's generated in those local languages is actually all on Facebook. There isn't some 20 other online publications who can actually compete with what's on Facebook. All that material is there. And then you have a situation like in Myanmar where the government spreads fake news that starts to, as is described in the film, go after the Rohingya minority group. And there's no counterbalancing force. In fact, in that case, in 2013 or 14, there was only 4 Burmese speakers who can even do the content moderation, would have any idea what's going on in that country. Now, zooming out, you say, okay, Facebook is managing about 80 elections per year. So we all care about the upcoming US election. We care about whether, how well Facebook deals with some of the issues that are present now in this country. But then you zoom out and say, do they have teams that speak the languages of all the countries that they have colonized? I mean, it's a form of digital colonialism when they create infrastructure where they don't even have the staff in those countries and the people who are representative. And so across the board, I would also just add, in every case, if you don't have expertise or the stakeholders, as Kathy said, where the people closest to the pain are not closest to the decision-making or closest to the power, that's a huge problem.
And I want
to add, Katie, if I could just add there, you just said something about the people inside the companies and kind of their intentions. And one of the things from my experience in having the conversations over the last few years, I think there are a lot of people at the companies that do mean well, that are well-intended, yet they're stuck with this problem. They're stuck with this business model. There's a phrase in coding that I've heard, inherent vice. So it's like they, even acknowledging the problems of the code, they still built around those problems. And now they've grown to a scale that is affecting all of society. So even if they wanted to make changes, you have to overturn the entire business model. You have to overturn the entire valuation by the stock market. So when you talk about getting diversity of opinion into these companies, diversity in a lot of ways is needed, but I think we also need to really question the fundamental business model of what's driving these companies. I often make a comparison to the fossil fuel industry. And the fossil fuel industry seemed really awesome to humanity when we started it, and it gave us great power and opportunity, but years later we're seeing the consequences of that. And the same thing with our social media technology and this business model of attention and this advertising targeted business model. Like, we need to figure out how can we flip this model upside down and create financial models that work in alignment with people, in alignment with humanity and society, and can take all of these factors into consideration when really aligned for the public good.
And Tim, why can't they change their business model? I mean, how much money does Mark Zuckerberg need?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than just his wealth, but I think the trick is that it's what Jeff said. You know, the business model is advertising, and the value of the company is multiples of the amount of revenue. And it's just predicated on that revenue continuing to grow and grow and grow. And so if they were to map a path where they were to segue off of that business to something else, let's just say asking users to pay, so much value would be destroyed. The company probably wouldn't be recognizable. Or at least I can't come up with a creative way for how they would do that on their own accord in a way that wouldn't just destroy hundreds of billions of dollars of shareholder value. I just don't see a tractable path, which is why I think that governments are going to have to play a role. And I think we as individuals are going to have to play a role in terms of having our own reckoning and applying our own pressure to these companies.
Speaking of a reckoning, you know, Rashida, we have seen just this phenomenal social justice movement unfold in the last 6 months or so following the murder of George Floyd and, of course, Ahmaud Arbery and so many other instances that we almost hear about on a weekly, if not daily basis. And I was curious, you said that these technologies make it harder for you to do your work. And I'm curious if you can explain why.
Yes, so I guess part of explaining why I made that comment is because a lot of my work has been looking at not only commercial uses like social media platforms, but also uses of algorithms and data-driven technologies within the government sector. So I've written about the use of predictive policing and risk assessments in the criminal justice system, which are just accelerating the racial disparities within that sector. But they're often...
Will you explain what that means, Rashida, for people?
Yeah, so predictive policing is a technology that relies on police and other data to predict who may be a victim or a perpetrator of a crime or where a crime may occur. And risk assessments are actuarial tools that attempt to use historical data, perform statistical analysis to then predict decisions for similarly situated individuals, usually judges. So in both of these examples, they're technologies that are relying on historical data in a really racially biased and flawed system to make predictions about the future. And they're often adopted under the guise that they're more objective or fair or impartial, when the reality is they're just further concretizing the inequities that already exist in our society and then giving this gloss of fairness on top. So it's that when I give those examples, the challenge is you're not only dealing with the mythology that comes along with anything related to math, tech, science that we have in society, but you're also grappling with these deeper structural issues that we really haven't learned how to deal with as a society and trying to tackle them all at once. And then if you take that out and look at the private sector, you're dealing with similar issues in that, like, we've talked about misinformation, hate speech is another issue. These aren't new issues in society, but the design of these platforms are made so that they amplify these issues. And we're also dealing with a society that hasn't dealt with those issues, at least legally, in an equitable or manageable way to date. So we're asking both technology companies to solve problems we can't really solve, and then we're integrating similarly flawed technologies into our social systems and public systems that already have deep cracks in them, and then asking to solve those along with the tech issues on top.
What do you make of, Rashida, when Facebook says, we have AI that can, track and stop things like hate speech and misinformation? Is that a legitimate stance for that company to take? I mean, do they really have that? Because it seems, and Tristan, you and I have talked about this, when there's a piece of misinformation out there, by the time it's corrected. It's traveled through thousands, if not millions of people. My daughter actually, her job involves correcting misinformation on Facebook. She's very, very busy. But I always say, gosh, by the time you can evaluate it, it's been seen and shared over and over and over again. So can their AI really stop things, or is that just a PR thing?
It's PR. Tech isn't going to solve the tech problem. I think that's just a fundamental thing to understand. But also, like I said, these are very complicated issues in that if there isn't a clear roadmap, toolkit, or rubric for individuals to follow, it means they're making these subjective judgments at scale and with no clear guidance on how to make what are really consequential decisions. So I do think it is the responsibility of Facebook, Twitter, and these other platforms to monitor and understand how their platforms are contributing to these problems. But I do think it's misguided to suggest that AI is somehow going to solve or be the silver bullet solution to problems that are amplified by their technologies.
But Tim, how do they do that when there's so much information going through these pipes? You know, how do you keep up with it? I guess, isn't that sort of the nub of the issue? And you know, I'm particularly interested as the election is just around the corner. So much false information, so many just complete blatant lies that are being consumed and processed and then shared, and they're so powerfully influential. You know, and even friends of mine, I can tell when they've been fed stuff over and over and over again, because we sometimes can't even have a conversation, because I know the algorithms, they might have read something and then they just become this repository for like-minded content. And then I can't really have a conversation with them. And it's very frustrating, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but
I'm not either.
I'm on the receiving end of that too, and I think it does go back to Jeff's point and then other points that folks have made about the incentives. Look, like, misinformation is really good for their business. The spread and engagement of incendiary content is terrific for their unit economics.
Why? Because it plays to the attention economy idea and it keeps people hooked? Is that it?
Tristan should talk to this because he'll give the great wrapper around it. But yeah, I mean, it plays on our weaknesses. You know, it plays on our animal brain at the lowest level. And that's really good for business, because when that part of my brain is being tapped, I go into an unconscious mode where I am sucked in.
Sucked into the vortex.
Yeah, and I spend an inordinate amount of time, and the more time I spend on that platform, the more money they make from me. And if I really become a convert, I help spread it to other people, and then we make even more money from them.
Tristan, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just to sort of sum up where that leads to and to double down on what Tim is saying. I think Jeff even uses this line that, you know, this is a polarization for profit business model, because let's say Facebook has two possible versions of the newsfeed they could show. Let's imagine one newsfeed called the challenge feed. And so everything you see when you swipe, it challenges and expands and makes more nuanced your view of reality. Every single swipe you make. And then the other feed is called the affirmation feed. It just it shows you why you're right, you're right, you're right, you're right. You're even more right than you thought. Here's even more evidence about why the other side is even more crazy, more whatever it is that you hate. Which of those two feeds is going to keep you coming back, right? The affirmation feed, right? And so I think that the most nuanced point in the film that I think is so critical for people to get is that these technology systems have taken this shared reality and put it through this paper shredder where we each get our own 3 billion Truman shows. Each one of us has our own reality. And if those realities are not compatible with each other, which they're not, because the way I get your information is to show you different facts that are completely different, of a different kind and frame than the other facts, it makes it impossible to have a conversation. And if we cannot have consensus and agreement, when you disagree with someone, you can't just say, I don't want you on the planet, or I don't want you voting anymore. So for anything we want to do, whether it's climate change, racism, inequality, any issue we want to tackle, it depends on us having a shared consensus view, semi-reliable consensus reality. And we need that to be able to do anything, which is why I think this is the existential threat that undergirds all the other issues. It makes our already difficult problems unsolvable. Now, the thing that gives me hope is that the film will create a shared truth about the breakdown of that shared truth. So instead of being caught in the mess of all of it, we actually have a shared conversation about the breakdown of our shared conversation. And that's an empowering place to stand. In fact, my favorite thing that I think Jeff recommends people do after watching the film is you watch it with other people who politically you disagree with, and you both, at the end of the film, open up Facebook on both your phones, and then you reality swap. You trade phones, and you see how if I was living in their feed, you know, if you saw my feed, you'd see like climate apocalyptic news and US-China escalating relations, and you'd say, oh my God, it makes sense why Tristan looks terrified all the time. You have a deeper empathy for where each of us are coming from. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that we can do, because honestly, the companies are not going to be able to change magically all of these things, as Tim just said. Not only is it against their shareholder pressure and their business model, but even if they put 100% of their resources to solving the issue, the growth rate of the harms, the conspiracy theories, the mental health, the degradation of our public square has far exceeded any of the product changes and developments that they can make. So we're left with culture. And the thing that gives me hope is that this film, being simultaneously released in 190 countries and in 30 languages, has shown, and I'm getting about 100 messages on Instagram about, per hour from people all around the world saying, oh my God, this is why we got the 5-star movement in Italy. This is why we got Bolsonaro in Brazil. And I think that shared context, that collective global will, is what we're going to be able to use to hopefully create a government response and also wake up the public that we've lost our shared conversation.
Before we talk about I'm going to go around the horn and get solutions, but it seems to me that this is going to be a real problem for the election. We're hearing about Russian interference, right? Again, we're hearing obviously about these echo chambers and how people are getting affirmation, not information. In my business, cable news is sort of following this model, right? With appealing to one side or the other, engagement through enragement, as my friend Kara Swisher says. So, is anything being done? I think it's sort of really lip service what's being done before the election. Can you explain, who wants to explain what Facebook is doing before November 3rd and what impact it will actually have? Anybody?
I can't speak to the specifics of what Facebook is doing, but
they're
in my mind, it's
political ads, right? The week before the election.
Right, but these are, I feel like anything that they do is a Band-Aid solution. Like they're plugging holes in a sinking ship, and this is not actually addressing the fundamental problem. Just like with climate change, we have broken down our environmental ecosystem, and these platforms have broken down our information ecosystem. And we're literally just rewarping and reshaping our sense of truth and understanding and shared conversation. And just like with climate change, even if we solved it right now, we would have a decade or more of inertia from the carbon buildup. Like the same problem exists here in my mind with our information breakdown, where these are not easy things to solve or undo. This is like we've been living through this mind warp for a period of time now. So the idea of solving stuff between now and the election is kind of a moot thing in my mind. We can make little Band-Aid steps, but already we've been fractured into different ways of seeing the world that are not going to undo quickly.
Right. In fact, a lot of these issues really haven't changed where people stand. I mean, they're pretty deeply entrenched. I interviewed Nate Silver, and he said there's been very little movement from one camp to another. People are kind of sticking with their tribalistic instincts. So you can tell that they are being, fed. But what's frustrating to me is that people don't trust the media, and people don't even understand what truth actually is and what facts actually are. Everything is being called into question, and it's for somebody who's been a journalist for a long time, that's exceedingly frustrating. Kathy, what are we going to do about potential Russian interference? Just kind of like say, oh, well, I guess we're going to have to live with it.
You know, it is really difficult, and I agree with you that it is trust itself that has been injured. And not just trust about any particular topic, but trust in the concept of authority and expertise. I'm writing a book now about how shame plays into all this, because I think that the sort of fuel that divides us and that makes us more and more tribal is literally shame and wanting to be outraged and shame the other side. So it is really hard, and I agree with Tim that it's not going to happen overnight, even if we turn off Facebook tomorrow, which I really wish we could do. I do want to say, though, that there are, smaller, easier problems to solve that would go a long way in some of the economic aspects of this. So, I mean, to be clear, there are, as I said before, algorithms that are deciding almost any bureaucratic choice that we go through. Anytime we touch a bureaucracy, it's an algorithm now. And they are not even being asked to comply with existing laws. That's how outside the system, that's how blindly trusted algorithms have been in the last 10, 15 years as they've popped up everywhere. So if you don't mind, I'm going to say, I don't know how to solve this big problem of Facebook democracy and trust, but I do want to say that we can solve smaller problems that are embedded inside this larger problem, like mortgage loans, like college admissions, like who gets a job. To Rashida's point earlier, like it's all about the historical propagation of bias. So let's ask LinkedIn to show us exactly how they matchmake between people looking for jobs and people who are looking to hire people, because I doubt that that's ever been vetted, and that's an algorithm that I think we can all agree will be extremely, extremely important in the coming months as we recover from this Great Depression. When all these people who have lost jobs need new jobs, they're going to go online, and they're going to be told which jobs exist by an algorithm. And, are they going to be shown all the jobs? No, they're going to be shown the jobs that the platform that they're on decides you deserve. Do you see what I mean? So this stuff is both economic and it's civic. Like we've been talking about the civic side of it. Like, what does it mean to be an informed citizen in the age of misinformation? That's a tough problem. But we can talk about who deserves a job, and let's make sure that that works. And that, I don't think that's irrelevant to this question of a civic-minded nation. We have to actually have an economic existence in order to get back to trust.
So what do you think the solution is, Tristan? You said watch the film, trade Facebook feeds. That's a really nice idea. I hope it happens. But I think you would concede that we need more.
Well, Katie, there's a short term and there's a long term. Long term, we need to move to a totally humane and just and equal and fair digital infrastructure. And as Kathy and Rashida pointed out, there's a quote from Mark Andreessen that software is eating the world, which is that software is technology is replacing every aspect of our physical infrastructure and our physical decision making. We're going to hand over to the machines. So we have to have, and I think Kathy has said this, kind of like an FDA for algorithms or some notion of responsibility for the ways that these things are steering society fundamentally. And that's a bigger conversation. When it comes to the shorter term, and we're talking about the election, you asked Katie about what are we going to do about Russia. I have friends right now at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center who are tracking multiple networks of hundreds of thousands of accounts that can be activated overnight in the days or months, days or weeks leading up to the election and drop news. It's important for people to realize, first of all, it's not just Russia, it's China, it's Iran, Saudi Arabia. Everyone's in on the game now. The KGB officers used to spend 25% of the time manufacturing disinformation stories. That's how you were successful at your job, was 25% of your time was inventing plausible things that could happen. So now you imagine that, while we've been obsessed with protecting our physical borders of this country, and we have a Department of Defense and we spend billions of dollars a year on that, while we've been protecting our physical borders, if Russia or China try to fly a plane into the United States, they're going to be shot down by the Department of Defense. But if they try to fly an information bomb into the United States, into Facebook, they're met with a white glove and an advertising algorithm that says, yeah, exactly which zip code or conspiracy theory group would you like to target? And I think we have to realize that our digital borders are completely unprotected, which means that people have to exercise a totally new degree of cynicism and skepticism about what they read on Facebook, except if it's probably from their closest friends that they know. It's not just the news, by the way, it's the comment threads. Russia, they work in threes, so they'll actually control the way that a conversation goes, and they'll generate conflict to try to steer it in one way or the other. I think that we fundamentally cannot trust the information that we're seeing, and we need a cultural movement, a global cultural awakening for this understanding that these are not authoritative platforms, which doesn't mean don't trust anything. It means that we have to recognize that these technology platforms are not trustworthy places to get information. And I really hope that the film does deliver that message. It's perhaps the one thing we can agree on is that these things have actually torn us apart. And that it's especially on bipartisan level, how it's eroded the mental health of our children, which everyone agrees is an enormous problem and is not a partisan issue. So that's the one thing that gives me hope.
I thought that was really well done with the young girl who you can see that she's just crushed when somebody makes fun of her ears. And, you know, even adults get crushed when people say mean things about them. And you can only imagine for a young, developing person who's trying to establish his or her sense of self, how horrible that is. And I think, you know, my daughter who's 29 says, gosh, I wish I grew up in the 70s when there was no social media, because that's when I grew up. And I'm like, I hear you. I don't, you know, it was hard enough as a teenager in the 70s to, you know, get through it relatively unscathed. I don't know how you do it today.
Could I share one thing on that, Katie, before? I know you're probably wrapping up, but we're evolved to care when people don't approve of us or don't like us, right? Because that's an existential issue for survival in a tribe. If the people in your tribe don't like you or they're saying negative things about you, our attention is going to be sent to that instantly. And it also sticks with us. So we'll end up sort of revisiting that over and over and over again in our minds, that negative thing that one person said. I've noticed that even with the film coming out, that about 99.9% of all the feedback is incredibly positive. But of course, what does my mind hold on to? It's that 0.1% of people who hate it, who said the worst possible things about me or about anybody else.
Hey, Tristan, welcome to my world.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing is I think, Katie, that celebrities and public intellectual figures in society had dealt with this for a long time. But now we've subjected every person to the masses, right? And it's this big gladiator tournament where if you say one thing that's wrong and sort of the context collapse, it's never been easier to see infinite evidence clicking deeper down the rabbit hole of people who want to hate on you. And I'm especially concerned about how that's affecting teenagers because they're so vulnerable. As you said, it affects all of us, but it affects young people the most.
Rashida, clearly it sounds like, you know, we need the government to act. And then I look at what's going on with the government right now, and it seems to me that more often than not,
they do nothing.
Huh?
They do nothing.
Well, not only they do nothing, but they actually seem to be exploiting the divide and polarization that is resulting from all the things we've been discussing. So I guess my question to you is, should the government get involved? And what do you think the appetite is for some kind of oversight, some kind of regulation?
Yes, the government should get involved, but I think where you go from answering that becomes more complicated because we're not talking about just one issue. You could have civil rights enforcement, antitrust enforcement, privacy enforcement, and even when I name those three categories, we don't necessarily have regulatory or legal frameworks for addressing the exact concerns we're talking about. So we are grappling with very complex and nuanced issues. So I do want to give people in government some credit that they're trying to learn real time and figure out what to do, but there's also a range of actions that need to be taken because we're talking about companies that are not only functioning as communication technologies, but also advertising companies. So if you take a sectoral approach, which do you do? Can you do both? And then I think we're also dealing with, as I said earlier, a compounded effect of societal problems that have always existed that we never have really wanted to grapple with. So in some ways, we also need more robust and structural reform to address some of these issues. And I do think there is an appetite, or at least an understanding, that something needs to be done. But I think what's happening, not only here in the US, but internationally, is that every government is trying to grapple with where to start, because we're dealing with so many different issues, and it's hard to prioritize one certain fix over the other, or figure out how many different forms of regulation can work together to address the myriad of issues we've discussed today and in the film.
But Rashida, when it's operating to the benefit of some of these authoritarian governments that are popping up all over the world, it seems to me that they're not going to be really jonesing to address these problems, because they've come to power as a result of the problems ostensibly they should be fixing, right, you guys?
Yeah. You are dealing with some governments that have a self-interest in maintaining the status quo, and that's not simply in authoritarian regimes, but also in democracies. But you're also dealing with the problem that the majority of these companies are based in the United States and are US companies, and therefore regulated by our lack of laws here. So you're dealing with the need for national reforms for how issues are affected within certain jurisdictional boundaries, but also just a global problem with global scale companies and the inability for us as a globe to really understand how to regulate and deal with issues that are not isolated within the borders of one country.
Right. Tim and Jeff, what do you think? Are you optimistic that something's going to be done? And if you could wave a magic wand, Tim, good luck. How would you fix this huge problem that's so, as Rashida said, so multifaceted?
Yeah, I mean, I think philosophically, I'm more focused on bottoms up, probably because I'm just more comfortable with that, which is just like starting with the individual. When I think about global systemic problems like climate change, or even cigarettes, right? The evolution of cigarettes from something that was actually good for you, and doctors were doing it, to now where it's absolutely socially rejected. I think two things happened, right? People had a reckoning with their own, in climate change case, their own contribution to it. Do I have an SUV in my driveway? Like, what is my carbon footprint? And am I contributing to this problem that I now feel stronger and stronger about? And what changes can I make? And then so that is sort of all to say that at an individual level, one of the things that I spend my time on is trying to show people a really tight feedback loop about the impact that the phone has on them, right? I mean, the thing that happened with cigarettes is that it just became really clear that it was going to kill me. And the thing that's happened with sugar is that it's become really clear that I'm going to get diabetes and I might have a lot of problems beyond that. And so the compulsive and addictive usage of phones, right now, we don't have a feedback loop. We can't see the size of our brain changing, even though there's very clear data that it does. We can't see the onset of depression and anxiety, even though there's very clear data that it does. And so if I had a magic wand, I would try to create transparency around that feedback loop. So we knew incrementally, when I spend 4 hours on my phone tonight, what's the cost individually?
I think, Katie, my optimism comes from my pessimism, the same with climate change, in that I think things are going to get worse, and we're going to push back at some point. That we as a society are going to realize, no, this is not acceptable. This is not how we want to move forward. And the stakes are so high, and it's so apparent to everybody, that we say, no, we need to about face. We need to change the system. And whether that comes from the goodwill of the fossil fuel industry, whether that comes from the goodwill of the tech industry, or whether that comes from regulation, those are the paths forward that I see. The status quo is unsustainable. It just will continue to break down and rip apart our society in a way that the public will not go for. And my hope here is that the film and countless people like everyone here on this conversation and many, many more working in the industry can continue to just raise the alarm and talk about the problems and define the problems so that we can have a shared definition of this is what we need to address. This is what we need to fix. Can we agree on these basic facts so that we can look towards the solutions and what those solutions look like? And then I'm super eager to hear from Rashida and Kathy and the team and many, many more people around, like, what does meaningful policy look like? That's so beyond my expertise and my knowledge, but I'm hungry and eager to hear that. I want somebody to just put together a list of, let's do these things. And if we do these things, it makes a step in the right direction.
While you're completing that thought, I just looked at my screen time and it says 18 hours and 13 minutes. Tristan, is that really bad?
More than any of us, I think. No.
But wait a second, you guys, I'm writing a book and I use this to write. So my social networking, 2 hours and 9 minutes. That's bad too, huh?
I think we have to be careful. I especially want the parents out there to be not too hard on themselves, because what makes the situation inhumane is when we have a systemic problem for which we only have individual solutions. It's sort of like you see this massive problem and then the burden is only on what I can do, or look at my screen time. Just like I wouldn't want you to feel bad about how often you use your arm if you had a timer about how many minutes or hours a day you use your arm. The slab of glass that we have here is not by itself the evil. I'm more worried about the broader climate change of culture, the systemic issues that are really, really bad. And I think that we need a full court press solution. We need there to be individual actions that we can take and a cultural movement around that, which I hope the film starts, but never without the broader link to how do we change the system. So I think for everybody who, whether they download Moment or they turn off notifications or they take their whole school and say, you know what, as a school, we're going to move all the kids who are on TikTok or Instagram, because one thing parents should know is it's not about an individual taking their teenager off of Instagram when all my friends are still on Instagram and they're still talking and that's where all the homework and dating conversations are. It's not a viable solution. We need a group migration. So as we do all these individual things, that each of those people stay part of this conversation. They can do it through, Center for Humane Technology or any one of these other groups, but they need to become part of the movement to ask and demand for a much greater regulation and change. We don't want a world where it's just the individual. We want everyone to do the individual things and to participate in demanding the more systemic change that we need. On an earlier call I was on today, someone said, can we put the genie back in the bottle? Well, there's an interesting story of Tylenol in the 1980s where they literally did just that. They found there was poison in the tablets. And
I remember that.
Yeah, and they could have lied about it and said, you know what, actually there's no poison. We just have to make sure our stock price keeps going up. We're going to pretend it's not happening. And meanwhile, people keep dying and they keep putting the Tylenol out. In this case, they quite literally put the genie, they took it off the shelf until they invented the tamper-proof container. And that invention was when they put it back on the market. And the fact that they were transparent and honest about the problem, at first their stock price dropped dramatically, but then it actually went back to even higher than what it was before. And so I think that there's several things that short-term to stop the bleeding. We need them to do everything that they can, including turning off algorithmic amplification, not recommending Facebook groups. Twitter can untrend October, which is one of the things, to not have these trending topics which are easily gameable by foreign actors. There's a long litany of these kinds of things, and I think the diversity of the solutions need to be reflected in the people, not just on this call, but the broader community. That said, this is going to take a long time. So it's one of those multi-stage things, just like climate change. And I think Kathy should probably chime in.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I wrote a piece for Bloomberg, just came out a couple days ago, about TikTok's algorithm. There's a whole thing about who gets to own the algorithm, even if TikTok is sold. And I just made the obvious data science point that recommendation engines can be manipulated. And I just outlined how, if I control TikTok's algorithm, I know there's an anti-vaxxing viral video or a cluster of viral videos around anti-vaxxing, I could amplify those in the recommendation engine, or I could de-emphasize them. And I think of that as a good thing personally, because I know that meetup.com, they ad hoc changed their recommendation engine to make it less sexist. And that's something I want to see. You see, I would say that the thing that's most disingenuous about Zuckerberg's travels to Congress is this idea that by doing nothing, he's somehow being objective. By not, putting his thumb on the scale, that's somehow the default and the most reasonable suggestion to do. No, it is, he acts as if it's value free, but it's actually, of course, value laden. What he's saying is that the results of the choices we've made in maximizing engagement, as Tim mentioned, which of course encourages divisiveness and tribal and disagreement, that was a choice. That was a very value-laden choice. And you have that now the choice to do something else. You could say, hey, we should de-emphasize misinformation propaganda and anti-science rhetoric. They could do that. Are they going to do that? I doubt it. But I think the long-term point is that it is actually quite possible to do it, Katie. It's also quite possible to regulate algorithms and force them to follow rules. And as I've said a couple of times now, like, my goal in the short term is to convince us and regulators and lawmakers and policymakers that once you've built a law in plain English, you can force an algorithm to follow that law. We don't know what the laws need to be for Facebook and social media, but they need to be something like, this has to work for the public good, not just for your profit. And once we translate that, we can force them to follow that rule.
And Jeff, you wanted to say something? You're
Yeah,
the director
I was going to add.
so why don't you close things out?
Oh, well, I was going to add just one comment to what Kathy was saying there. And I just heard this recently, and it's from a reliable source, but not somebody inside Facebook. But apparently that as comments get closer and closer to their terms of service and how extreme things get, they actually do algorithmic, those apparently spread exponentially, and those are being tampered down along the terms of service. It's interesting because the more extreme something gets, the more rapidly it spreads. But that's something that I've heard is very speculative, but to your point, Kathy, I don't think it's tying into all the aspects of misinformation that we're discussing here. But Katie, just to close from my perspective, I'm so grateful for this team and everybody that we have here for sharing their stories, for sharing their voice, and for helping to elevate this issue. I knew nothing about this going into this a couple of years ago, and it was from all of these conversations that I got to see just how there is this invisible change happening in our society through this code that we interact with every day, that nobody realizes what's hiding on the other side of their screen. And my hope here through all of these voices is that people can wake up and see and recognize that there is something that we need to pay attention to as a society. There's something that we need to demand change to. There's something we need to demand transparency into. Just as Kathy was saying, like, there are these opaque algorithms that drive our lives that we have no insight into how they operate. And that's really scary. It's something that touches each and every one of us, and we don't know what's driving it. So that is my biggest hope, is that this can be a wake-up call, and that our society can rally together and say, we want to do something about this.
Thank you guys so much for this conversation. It was so critically important and so informative. Rashida, Tristan, Kathy, Tim, Jeff, I really enjoyed speaking to all of you, and I cannot encourage everyone enough to watch The Social Dilemma. You did a fantastic job and took a lot of complicated issues and made them extremely accessible, I think, for the average person. So it's on Netflix. It's called The Social Dilemma, and please check it out. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Katie. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.